Well, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. And whoever has a camera, please take a picture of me in front of this podium. This is really kind of just a very unique podium, and I just want to be associated with it. I was here last year in a session, and then we also did a meeting at the California Endowment 2 years ago to talk about community policing and public health and the strategies that are common between those two things. And when I was first asked to do it, I thought, yeah, I could say a thing or two about that, but I'm not sure I necessarily see it. But then I started to think about it, and I started to think about some of the experiences that I had working as a public health officer in concert with law enforcement partners. I was the director of health in the city of Stamford, Connecticut, and one of your colleagues, Dean Esserman, was the chief of police there, and worked with him quite extensively in Stamford to carry out a whole host of things, some of which I'll talk about tangentially in this presentation. And then I was the health officer in Alameda County, and worked with the sheriff in Alameda County. I don't know if any of you know Sheriff Plummer, who's a real character, Charlie Plummer, yeah, Alameda County, who was a very good friend, colleague, and partner in the work that we did there. So I have a lot of good sort of memories about working with law enforcement. Although I'll say this morning when I was out getting coffee, every time I saw somebody in a uniform, I'd think, oh, the cops are here. I wonder what's going on. It still kind of catches me off guard. Anyhow, so I want to tell you a little bit about sort of how public health has sort of evolved over the past, really about a decade. And some of the challenges that have faced public health that are very parallel to the challenges that I think are facing law enforcement. But let me just start by kind of giving you a sense of where public health is right now. I like to start with my conclusions because I think it's really important for people, particularly non-public health people, to get what I'm saying right up front. I don't like to hide the ball. And I'm also a lawyer, and one of the things you learn when you're a lawyer is to state your conclusions up front because you never know when you're going to be interrupted by somebody. So you want to get it out there so that you get it out there. So health doesn't equal health care, and a lot of people are coming to realize this, that health care is a piece of health, but it's a relatively small piece. And it's a remedial piece. In other words, it doesn't necessarily prevent people from getting sick, but it does help people deal with the consequences of having gotten sick. Where you live matters a lot more to your health. And we've translated this into, does your zip code mean more than your genetic code? So when you're a health officer in Alameda County or in California, you have this incredible breadth to your power. Which basically means if you have a lot of broad power, you basically have no specific power. And the broad power is that, in essence, and this is what this statute says, is that health officers, when they have a reason to believe that there is a disease spreading, typically an infectious disease, they have the power to take all measures as may be necessary to prevent the spread of that disease and the occurrence of additional cases. So, we liked that in California because it was broad. But it was very difficult to enforce because to have that kind of broad power but no real enforcement resources other than the sheriff or the local police meant that you better have a relationship with the sheriff or the local police because when you need them, they are pretty much the one indispensable tool that you cannot be without. So, public health was kind of a sleepy little discipline until roughly 2001. I was in Stamford, Connecticut, and we had some interesting events that happened at that time in that place. But, really before 2001, other than HIV, public health was kind of on the decline. Most infectious disease was sort of, being eradicated in the developed world. And chronic disease, like heart disease and cancer and whatnot, were becoming sort of more of the staples of health. So public health wasn't seen as being as necessary. And as many of you have no doubt experienced, we witnessed a pretty significant decline in funding for public health. But then came September 11th, and the world really changed for us. I was in Stamford, Connecticut, and there was a 93-year-old woman who died of anthrax in Stamford that ultimately was traced back to a postal distribution center in Connecticut from essentially spores of anthrax that were on a piece of mail that contaminated another piece of mail, that contaminated yet another piece of mail that actually ended up in her mailbox. So we had to spend quite a significant amount of time trying to figure out how do we do the epidemiological investigation to figure out how this woman died of anthrax. And we did this in concert with the local police, with the FBI, with the state police and the Centers for Disease Control, and developed a protocol for essentially testing the postal distribution centers to look for spores of anthrax. And of course, all of that stuff led to a very different kind of sensibility about the need to build up public health's infrastructure. Anthrax obviously is a very significant disease, although relatively easily treated with antibiotics. But the spores can last for a very long time, and therefore it created almost the perfect biological weapon because you could essentially use a very small amount and cause quite a bit of damage to people before they realized what was going on. And of course, the associated anxiety, panic, all those white powder incidents that followed immediately thereafter caused a great deal of burden on local law enforcement and others. Then, of course, there was smallpox, and a great concern that there may be somewhere in the world a group of people plotting to weaponize smallpox and deliver it as a biological weapon. And of course, that required a lot of us in public health to start to figure out, well, what kind of countermeasures could we develop that could allow for the population to be protected and also to detect a smallpox outbreak and contain it. And then came SARS. And we all remember SARS because it really came out of the blue. It was something that nobody had ever heard of before. And these all came literally within a period of about 3 or 4 years of each other. So it was like a whole new era of public health was developed. And so we had to dust off our approaches to managing outbreaks. And we'd always done this for tuberculosis and for foodborne disease. But for these new respiratory diseases and some of these new viral diseases, it became a very different kind of acuity. We really needed to make sure that our response capacity was very well refined. And so this is where the parallel to law enforcement really became clear to me. Because these are the 4 things that we do in public health to try to manage a disease outbreak. We do surveillance. We try to figure out essentially what's going on in the community, what kind of evidence is there that something unusual might be happening, and that might be checking through hospital records or emergency room visits or having physicians essentially call in to tell us, well, I saw this case of something that looked very unusual. Then we do disease control, which is very simply, what are the means we need to employ to interrupt the cycle of transmission of this disease? And we coordinate, and this is where law enforcement becomes very important because and you'll see in a second, if you've got to shut down a movie theater, a guy with a stethoscope is not going to be able to do that. So you need law enforcement working with you, and we need to communicate. We need to communicate messages that are meaningful. So surveillance, quite frankly, is very straightforward. It's what is it? How widespread is it? How is it being transmitted? And who is at risk? And you'll see some of the parallels to law enforcement in a few minutes. Control is, again, how to interrupt the cycle of transmission. It may be that we need to get antibiotics out there, pharmaceutical measures. We may need to use quarantine or isolation, which again requires some sort of enforcement mechanism. We may need environmental measures, like West Nile virus came along roughly the same time, and we had to spray, in some instances using helicopters and other vehicles. Or we might have to employ behavioral measures. Coordination, the most important resource that you need is security. And that sort of goes without saying, and public health learned that very quickly. But we also need to transport things. We may need body bags. all sorts of things that you have to prepare yourself for in these circumstances. And then finally, the communication need, which is what we used to call the 3 Ps. I mean, these are the 3 messages that you have to get out there, because if you don't get them out there, other messages will spread in their absence and actually cause panic. So you need to make sure the politicians are saying the right things, because they have to say something. They always have to say something. And they tend to say whatever comes to their mind if you don't script them. So we have to script them very carefully. We have to talk to physicians and providers who are seeing the patients coming in, asking about these things, and we have to talk to the general public. So that's what, the basic framework of managing an outbreak of disease is. Now I want to take you into what is sort of the modern challenge in public health, which is, I think, relevant to the practice of community policing, because it's in essence looking at how chronic disease, or the conditions that promote chronic disease, are created, and what it is that we can do using data and analysis of that data to actually predict patterns of disease or outbreaks of certain types of crime. So if you think about chronic disease as sort of a sustained, slow-moving outbreak, as opposed to something like SARS or smallpox, then one of the measures that you can use to analyze it is actually life expectancy, which is, are there things happening out there in the community that are constraining people's actual length of life? And life expectancy is a very useful set of data, because we have comprehensive data sets on death. And I used to like to say, when I was the health officer in Alameda County, I'd say, "You're not dead until I say you're dead." And it was true, because the death certificate was the only official record of your death, and I was the recorder of death. And so if you died, until we had a complete death certificate and we had all the data on that death certificate, I wouldn't sign it, and therefore you would not yet be dead. So it was a good mechanism for actually getting very good comprehensive data. And we had about 10,000 deaths a year in Alameda County. So it was a very comprehensive data set, and everybody in this room, hopefully, will ultimately have a death certificate if you die in some place where people actually know that you have died. So it's your job to actually manage some of the data on this death certificate. One of the things that you can tell from the death certificate is what you died of. You can also tell how old you were when you died, what your race, ethnicity was, and where you lived. And those 4 pieces of data can give you a very detailed depiction of the patterns of death in a community. And you can use those patterns of death to try to understand larger forces in that community which are shaping people's life expectancy. Let me try to explain that to you. So this is California, that's the San Francisco Bay Area. This is zoomed up, that's San Francisco, and then this is Alameda County here, which is shaped like a boot that's trying to crush San Francisco, which is something we fantasized about all the time. And so that's where I was the health officer. And so you can take that death certificate and you can translate it. This is the boot again. Each of those little subdivisions is a census tract or a neighborhood, roughly 10,000 people. There are about 150 of them in Alameda County. And so you can calculate at the neighborhood level the average age to which people live. And when you do that, you find this interesting pattern, and that is that premature death in Alameda County clusters. And you have these hot spots of premature death. So the red areas are where people on average live to about 74 years. The yellow areas are between 74 and 80 years, and the green areas, on average, people live to about 80 years. So a pretty significant difference. When you're talking about life expectancy differences on a sort of an international scale, the differences between countries may be on the order of months, although the full spectrum is actually pretty broad. So this difference is pretty significant. The red areas basically have roughly the same life expectancy as the developing world. So a country like Bhutan or Pakistan might have a life expectancy of high 60s, low 70s. And then over 80 years, you see places like Japan and Germany and the like. So you have the socio-ecological equivalents of Pakistan and Japan in the same county. And you have this all over the United States. I'll show you some examples of that. This is Seattle, King County, which did a similar analysis, came up with the same basic results. This is Baltimore, Maryland, where I was born, which shows dramatic disparities between certain neighborhoods throughout Baltimore. This is Los Angeles, again, showing some very significant differences. I'm going through this pretty quickly, but you're all welcome to have this data if you want to find out how long you're going to live. This is Cuyahoga County, Cleveland. And they have, to date, the distinction of having the greatest disparity we've been able to measure thus far. There's a neighborhood in East Cleveland called Huff. Anybody from Cleveland here? Huh? So you know Huff?
I'm the County Sheriff.
Oh, okay. Well, you may have seen this before. It was in the newspaper. And just down the road in Lyndhurst, there's another community with a life expectancy of 88.5 years. So you're talking almost a quarter century of life expectancy difference in a very short geographical distance. And it is impossible to explain this difference by healthcare or even behaviors. So there's something else driving these profound differences. And it's important to understand when you're witnessing behaviors in some of these communities, what some of the forces are that are creating those behaviors, because those are the same forces that are creating these life expectancy differences. So back to Alameda County in the boot again, you can take the census tract map of life expectancy, which is the one on the bottom right, showing life expectancy by census tract. And then on the top left, you can do poverty. Just go to the census, and for each census tract, find out what the household poverty rate or the average income is, whatever measure of poverty you want to use. And then you can correlate those two things. And I promise this won't be too much math. It's pretty straightforward. For every census tract, and there are about 150 of them, you have a poverty rate and you have a life expectancy. So you can correlate those on a graph. And life expectancy is on the axis going up, and poverty is on the lower axis. So as you move from left to right on this graph, you're moving from relatively wealthy communities to relatively poor communities, and each of those blue dots is a neighborhood. So the neighborhood has a poverty rate and a life expectancy. And in an ideal world, you would expect to see this as a flat line. How poor your neighborhood is shouldn't predict how long you live. But we don't live in an ideal world, and there's a cost to living in a low-income neighborhood, and you can measure it in premature death. So I like to refer to this as the true death tax. This is the price of living in a poor neighborhood paid for in loss of years. And so we started in Alameda County to tell people, give me your address and I'll tell you how long you're going to live. And it's true, we could do it. I could actually do it in this room. And it's not because, yeah, I know, you don't really want to know. Or maybe you do, I don't know. Some people want to know. And it has nothing to do with me. It's not like I'm some sort of super genius or something like this. It really has more to do with how we array opportunity in our society, so that we constrain people's opportunity in certain communities because we constrain their access to a whole host of resources which are necessary for long and healthy lives. So a lot of people would see this and say, well, I don't want to live in Alameda County. Sounds like a horrible place. So we did it for San Francisco, we did it for Contra Costa County, which is one of our neighboring counties, and we did it for the San Francisco Bay Area as a whole. That's 6.5 million people. And then we did it for the state of California as a whole. And we're looking for the place anywhere that has a completely flat line, and we haven't found it yet, with one exception, which I can talk about later. But in the San Francisco Bay Area, we wanted people to understand what this meant, so we monetized it. And what it calculates down, the slope of that line basically calculates down to $12,500 in household income buys you a year of life. And so I would jokingly say to people, you know, the next time you're negotiating a raise with your boss, or, or the union, steward needs a good data point to, bring into the negotiations, this is the kind of stuff you should be using. And you can just imagine the conversation, kind of like the boss is like, Iton, you've had a pretty unproductive year, I'm seeing you maybe 6 months, 6 months tops in terms of a raise. I'm like, come on, I got to see my kid get out of high school. I got to see that other kid of mine, make sure that, gets married or something. But this is real stuff. I mean, this is very replicable. In other words, this is not just sort of like a fluke. You find this all throughout the United States. And the slope of that line, how steep that line is, varies a little bit. I'll show you that in a second. This is a slightly different measurement. This is called age-adjusted mortality rate, which is the inverse of life expectancy. So a high mortality rate is bad, low is good. And these are all of the communities across the country that we've compared the slopes of those lines. So moving again from left to right, you're moving from relatively wealthy communities to relatively poor communities. And what you see is this sort of, on the left side of that graph, these communities kind of cluster together, kind of. There are some exceptions. But they cluster together, which argues that you can't buy yourself immortality, right? So Bill Gates will not live to 3,064 years old. Physiology at some point kicks in. So on the wealthy side, you're going to see sort of like just a plateauing. You're not going to be able to get below a certain mortality rate because everybody dies. But on the far right, you see this fanning out of mortality rates, which argues that there are essentially different conditions in those communities that are producing different stressors on those populations, which are producing different outcomes in terms of mortality and life expectancy. And so most of that is man-made. And I like to say it can be unmade by the work of women for the most part. But it can be undone. It is not natural. It is a product of our own doing. Okay, so we recognize that in our work we have different communities on different life trajectories. In the green, we have high trajectory communities that have high measures of social attainment that you can get from the census. The yellow communities are sort of intermediate high, and the red communities are low and struggling. And people, for the most part, again, it's important when you look at this data that you don't think about individuals. You're thinking about communities and you're thinking about odds. Because everybody will come and tell me a story, and I'm sure somebody will probably be thinking this right now. Well, my grandmother came over, the potato famine, and, lived in the worst slum in New York City, and, worked really hard, and now she's the CEO of Xerox, and if she could do it, anybody could do it. And the truth is that, while your grandmother's story may be true, and there are a whole host of sort of Horatio Alger stories throughout this country, for the most part, the likelihood of that being true is low, which is why it's an interesting story. And this work is about changing the likelihood. It's not about making more of your grandmother. It's about essentially changing the odds that we'll have more of those stories. So in the high trajectory communities, you have relatively high measures of resiliency, high measures of resources that protect people's health, and relatively few risk factors, but you do see risk factors. In the intermediate trajectory communities, you have a slightly fewer number of the resiliency or resource factors and slightly more risk. And then in the low trajectory communities, where we spend an enormous amount of money and time in public health trying to provide services to mitigate the consequences of their environment, and where policing is disproportionately arrayed resource-wise, there are relatively few resources, and then a whole host of risks, including poor performing schools and poor jobs, difficult housing, racial and economic segregation, and a whole host of other factors, again, that are man-made. And then we tell this kid the Horatio Alger story, as if to motivate him. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And for the most part, that's what our societal policies are arguing. We do a whole bunch of services, although I could argue, and I do in another talk, that services aren't really the answer. We need to invest. We need to create essentially opportunity rather than just mitigate damage. But for the most part, we don't really have anything to offer this kid other than to arrest him when the frustration and anger builds up in him about the sort of environment in which he's living and he acts out. Okay, so I grew up in a neighborhood that looks like this in Montreal, Canada. I was born in Baltimore, but I grew up in Montreal, Canada. It was a wonderful neighborhood. We were very middle class, but I felt like I could do anything. When I went to Baltimore, I saw communities that looked like this, and these are communities that we're working with in East Oakland. And I thought, well, what does this kid think about his future, his potential? I mean, what is the message to this kid on a day in, day out basis about how society values him? And I can't get past that. This is man-made. This is not natural. We allow for these conditions to exist. And we know the consequences of that kind of messaging to young people. And then we are surprised when they act out. And I think that that's on us. It's like we're lacking the critical thinking skills. It's not so much the people living in these communities. They're any human being exposed to these kinds of conditions, and I'll explain to you in a minute how that happens, will have adverse physiological consequences. Okay, these are grocery stores in some communities. Others have nothing but junk food, liquor that's essentially advertised. This is the distribution in Alameda County of liquor licenses. As you move from left to right, you're moving from relatively wealthy to poor. This is a foreclosure heat map in a community we're working in Fresno, and we're working in the area in the red, and that just shows the concentrations of foreclosed homes. This is some data on payday lending. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly, but showing that payday lenders are 2.5 times more likely to concentrate independent of income in neighborhoods that are African American and Latino. These are policy-related phenomena, so that those communities are essentially preying on low-income communities of color, and we recognize the adverse consequences of that and the sort of vicious cycle that people get into in financial affairs. This is a very disturbing map in Los Angeles showing a correlation between math proficiency and prison populations. And of course, I like to ask people, is there anybody in this room that doesn't generate any garbage? You know, I was doing this talk in Marin County one time, and the guy put up his hand, and I didn't know what to say. I was like, wow, well, this doesn't apply to you then. We all benefit from these land uses, but disproportionately, the communities that we end up spending a lot of public health resources in and policing resources in are situated proximate to these kinds of land uses. So it's not fair, right? I mean, because breathing this kind of pollution we know has adverse consequences on your health. So how do these neighborhood conditions actually get under the skin? And I think this is the toughest thing for many of us to understand, because we are just completely steeped in this notion of individual responsibility and this notion of essentially pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which I recognize is completely true. It is true. Individual responsibility and personal responsibility does matter, but it is not the whole story. Societal responsibility matters too, and we should be able to hold those two ideas together simultaneously and not pose them as some sort of dichotomy. It's either individual responsibility or societal responsibility. No, it's both of those things. Those things have to work together. And so it's difficult sometimes for people to understand, well, you know, if I was living in this community, I would just work hard, I'd put my head to the, grindstone, and I'd study, and I'd get out of there. And a lot of people do, many people do in these communities, but many people don't. And we try to understand why. What is it that those forces are doing to people's physiology? Well, in 1993, there was this seminal paper in the medical literature which talked about, let's stop talking about diseases, because most of the diseases that are killing people or making them sick are caused by a handful of other factors, and it was referred to as the actual causes of death, and they were broken into these 4 categories: the environment, access to health care, biology or genetics, and then this whole notion of lifestyle, what you eat, what you drink, whether you smoke, whether you exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Since that time, this was considered to be radical and groundbreaking in 1993. Since that time, we've learned that these categories, these walls between these categories, are actually not so impervious, and that the environment actually does change your genes. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to know more about it. This whole concept of what's called epigenetics, which is essentially, I'm going to make this very simple, but it's completely fascinating. If you have 2 identical twins and you put them in radically different environments, their genes, which are identical, will express themselves differently. Their genetic expression will differ dramatically based on the environment. So your genes and your environment interact. And this notion of nature versus nurture is a false dichotomy. nature and nurture interact. So that was a fascinating recognition that's come up over the past few years since this article was published. But the more interesting question is, does the environment shape your behavior? Does the environment make it more likely that you'll act out violently? Does the environment make it more likely that you will essentially eat a lot of sugar? Well, let me try to explain how this works. This concept of allostatic load, which is a fancy medical way of saying chronic stress. There are a whole host of stressors that we all experience, and a good friend of mine likes to say, the person who's not experiencing stress is dead. So we all have stress. What differs is our access to resources to essentially manage that stress. And essentially the balance between stressors and resources is what creates physiological changes. If that balance is way out of balance, you have physiological changes. So all of these things, long commute times, poor housing, social isolation, crime, lack of access to basic amenities, create stressors for us, but those that have resources can actually deal with those stressors. How does this work? Well, the body interprets the stressor through the brain. The brain sends a message to a gland at the base of the brain called the pituitary gland, which sends another message to the adrenal glands, which sit right next to the kidneys, which releases a cascade of hormones when the body is stressed, amongst which is cortisol. And cortisol has very interesting impacts on the body. And let me explain this to you. In the blue is acute stress. And that is, for instance, somebody who comes up and has to speak in front of a room, in front of the Department of Justice banner, might be experiencing some acute stress. And so that, that it's going to affect your ability to your breathing changes, your cardiac output changes. A whole host of neurological functions are essentially made more acute and sharp. And that's good. This is the fight or flight response, which law enforcement officers see all the time. But in the red is chronic stress. And this is what happens, in essence, when you don't have the ability to essentially find the resources to manage the acute stress. And that stressor is constantly with you, constantly gnawing at you, constantly producing this sort of threat to you. And there, cortisol does almost the exact opposite. It actually turns up your body's inflammatory system. It turns down your immune system. It actually influences the way that you process things like sugar, and it makes you essentially hungrier for sort of fast sugar loads. It changes your brain, and this is very important, I think, for law enforcement, because people who are under chronic stress don't think well. They tend to be very forgetful. They tend not to process information well. They tend to be very reactive. That's a physiological response to chronic cortisol secretion. This is so significant and so new that the journal Pediatrics has actually suggested that we need to radically reinvent the whole field of pediatric medicine to deal with this concept of acute stress. And I'm going to tell you very quickly about this adverse childhood experiences study at Kaiser, which looked at 17,000 Kaiser enrollees, virtually all of whom were white, middle class, employed, and insured, and then stratified their adult health based on adverse childhood experiences. And the bottom line in this study was that the more adverse childhood experience this population had, the worse their adult health was. And there was a direct correlation between the number of adverse childhood experiences and the state of their adult health. And that means things like cardiovascular disease, cancer, alcoholism, a whole host of things that correlated directly to their exposure to adversity in childhood. So the argument here is, and I'm going to take you through this fairly quickly, the right side of this is what's called the medical model, which basically says people's behavior produces risk of disease, which produces premature death. And we know that, and you can intervene with medical care, you can intervene with health education, and you can intervene to some extent with genetics. The argument, though, is that that's not the whole story, that those outcomes are produced by a whole host of upstream phenomena that we have some control over. Downstream, we call these health disparities. Upstream, we call them health inequities. Health inequities are amenable to change. We can actually change these things through the acts of essentially organized society. You can take the word health out and just talk about inequities producing disparities. And if you're like me and a simple person, you want to just talk about conditions producing consequences. And we spend a lot of time in law enforcement and public health in consequence management. And we don't spend a lot of time trying to alter the conditions upstream. And so you can take the downstream conditions, take the health out of it, and make it school, educational outcomes. School absence produces grade failure, which produces dropout. The upstream conditions are exactly the same. So our argument is that you have to focus upstream and that there are things that you can do to try to change those conditions. There's things you can do in place with people, things you can do about the policies that create those places and those conditions, and things that you can do about the narrative. This whole Horatio Alger story that, I did it by myself, I had no help, and society is not responsible for me, is false. It's a false narrative. It's an incomplete narrative. And we argue that you have to actually engage and enlist the people who are most susceptible to these adverse outcomes in the crafting of the solutions. Okay, so that's what building healthy communities is, and that's what I run, and I'm not going to talk to you about that today, but I'm happy to take any questions about it. It's an effort to we're taking $1 billion over the next 10 years to try to transform 14 low-income communities that are experiencing high rates of high school dropout, high rates of premature disease, high rates of juvenile criminality. We're trying to change those conditions in those communities in a way that has an impact on those outcomes by investing in those upstream phenomena, which means working with law enforcement, working with the education system, working with the criminal justice system, working with the land use system to try to create conditions and resources in these low-income communities that will allow people to essentially take fuller advantage of opportunity. We call our work Health Happens Here, and I'm happy to take any questions about that. Thank you very much.
An obvious solution is to grow therapy in these communities. Therapy is often stigmatized. So how do you actually deal with suppressed maltreatment trauma in these communities if you don't just send them to doctors because in a lot of ways that's taboo?
So, two things. One is that there's this sort of idea that if you take a fish out of a polluted stream and you treat the fish and you inject them with antibiotics and steroids and whatever, but then put them back into the polluted stream, you haven't done very much. And so the argument is that you have to work on the fish and the stream simultaneously. So therapy works on the fish, but the conditions that incubate the stress and the, essentially the dysfunction in that community are still there. So the challenge is to do therapy at a community level and to do essentially therapy at the individual level simultaneously. So you're managing both sides of this equation. And that typically is not something we think about. We think about the kid who needs to be in mental health services, and the kid generally would benefit from that. But services are essentially time limited, and they're discrete, and they don't address the environment and the conditions that essentially produced the outcome that we're witnessing in the kids. So what we're arguing is that you have to do both of those things, and you have to do them in a way that they're basically interacting with each other. So that's part of the work that I didn't talk about, the whole spectrum of work that we're doing in these communities. But part of it is trying to heal the collective psyche of these communities that have been injured through historical insults and a whole host of economic deprivations. And to do that, it's kind of, for lack of a better word or lack of more time to talk about it, it's really like collective community therapy. Very similar, I would argue, to the presentation we had at lunch yesterday around the green dots, which is essentially trying to, and I thought about this last night, how do I make this clear to law enforcement folks? And one of the things that came to my mind is that, George Bush I used to feel sorry for him because, he'd be describing sort of the anti-terrorism work. And I suppose our Department of Homeland Security people would feel this pain too. it's very hard to prove a negative. So, you're doing all this stuff to sort of protect, resources and protect infrastructure, and nothing's happening. Everybody's saying you're wasting money, this is all overkill. And you can't say, but if we hadn't done this, we would have been attacked here on this day on that issue. So the whole notion is not to sort of, is to sort of harden your targets, make it harder for people to attack you, not to eliminate the possibility of being attacked. And it's the same thing in our communities. We're trying to harden them in a sense, in that we're trying to make it less easy for them to experience all of these societal insults. So how do you do that? You organize people, you bring them together, you give them a greater sense of control over decision-making in their communities. And that has salutary mental health benefits. That's well demonstrated in the public health literature. So that's in essence how you treat the fish in the stream simultaneously.